speak about, you suggest having the fee schedule in housing stability notice so that they know, your tenants know what it is. Do you also think it's a good idea to have these fees conspicuously posted when advertising for your units? Do you think that that would change if people knew that there were additional fees, that they might realize that, an extra, it may look like the rent's $1,100, but with the other fees, it might be more?
Mackenzie Warren Kay, thank you, Assemblywoman. I think the fee discussion is, something we're always willing to have. I think probably for today, we really came here to speak about summary eviction and our participation in the eviction diversion, and also our close work with Clark County. One positive thing to report that did come out of yesterday's meeting was the stark reality of CHAP coming to an end and a renewed focus on a fixed income CHAP program, if you will, which I think is really the critical next step. But as far as fees and how we disclose to our tenants and potential tenants, that's a conversation we are absolutely willing to have, just probably wouldn't be able to provide a sophisticated answer for today's hearing.
Thank you. All right. Do you have anything else to add?
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate you. At this time, I'd like to ask Dr. Tiffany Tyler Garner, Ms. Annette Dawson, Deshaun Jackson, and Ms. Erin Patterson of Children's Advocacy Alliance to step forward and bring a presentation to us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We know it's been quite a long day for you. We're appreciative of your leadership and commitment to holistic approaches to these complex social issues. We will try to be as brief as possible in our comments and welcome our opportunity to discuss any questions you may have after the presentation.
Dr. Tyler, would you please pull the mic a little closer?
Yes.
And for the record, folks, this is agenda item 9. Pardon me, 9. Thank you. Please proceed.
Sorry, we there we go. Awesome. So as I said, thank you so much for the time today. I should note as we get this set up that Children's Advocacy Alliance is a 23-plus year statewide, independent, nonpartisan child policy advocacy organization. Over the course of the year, we publish a number of reports to contextualize the state of children and families in the state in hopes that we might arm you with information to make some great decisions that move things forward for children in 4 key areas: education, economic well-being, which brings us to this table today, child welfare, as well as health. And as a part of that discussion, we just want to always underscore that because children really are our future, it's a worthy investment, including investing the time to understand more about this issue today. We thought that you would benefit from having some national context around what's happening with this issue. And so we've invited a colleague to join us today, Erin Patterson, Director of Education Initiatives with Schoolhouse Connection, where they have published a number of reports about the impact of housing instability on children. Erin, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me say good afternoon. Thank you to the committee and to the Children's Advocacy Alliance for the opportunity to share some brief remarks today. By way of introduction, Schoolhouse Connection is a national nonprofit advocacy organization. We are committed to overcoming homelessness through education. This is a recognition, the more education a person is able to attain, the less likely they are to experience homelessness, but it's also a recognition of the outsized role that learning programs and school districts play in identifying and supporting children experiencing homelessness and their families. As Dr. Tyler Garner mentioned, just to provide some national context, across the US, there are approximately 1.3 million babies, toddlers, and young children under age 6 experiencing homelessness. That's from the 2018 to 2019 school year, which is the most recent data available. And as you can imagine, the pandemic unfortunately has exacerbated those circumstances. And you'll hear more in just a moment about Nevada's population of children experiencing homelessness. I'd also like to briefly paint a picture for you of the challenges that families with young children experience when facing eviction. They are often forced to make impossible decisions about how to spend their limited financial resources. Those who have lost their job need childcare in order to actively pursue other job or training opportunities. But in many cases, even the childcare subsidy is not enough to cover the full cost of care. And the difference in cost is too much for them to pay out of pocket. If they do choose to pay for childcare, it often means they are forced to neglect other life expenses, sometimes including housing, which pushes them and their young children into eviction and homelessness. Once evicted, families are forced to move wherever they can in order to find shelter. And if their children were enrolled in a child care or early childhood program, they might be forced to stop attending because the distance from their new dwelling to the program is too far, and they have limited transportation options and experience other barriers. And at this point, homelessness becomes a multi-generational problem. Importantly, once evicted, most families with young children who become homeless will experience what we call hidden homelessness, and therefore will be shut out of other systems and services. And in fact, more than 80% of children and youth identified as homeless by public schools are actually staying with other people temporarily, what we call doubled up, or staying in motels. These hidden homeless situations are traumatic and they put children at risk of harm, but they are not recognized as homeless by housing and homeless assistance programs. The result is that most families who are evicted and displaced will not be eligible for or prioritized for housing and homelessness assistance. And I'd like to turn it back to Dr. Tyler Garner and my friends at the Children's Advocacy Alliance.
Sorry, Dr. Tiffany Tyler Garner for the record, now using the mic. I am joined by Annette Dawson-Owens, our School Readiness Policy Director, Deshaun Jackson, our Child Welfare and Safety Policy Director. And if we leave you with nothing else today, we hope that you embrace this, that summary eviction is a fast track to homelessness for many of our families, and that the latent effects of this pandemic are only exacerbated by the housing instability that ensues when we go through that process. So I'll just underscore here that housing impacts literally every domain of our lives, as well as every system in our community, and we'll talk about that a little more later. In an effort to contextualize that, I want to begin by just covering a few key facts from some publications that we issued throughout the year. A critical one that happened was a national survey by Kids Count performed by Annie E. Casey, where we looked at what they call the pain points for children and families during this pandemic. And unfortunately, I need to share with you that in terms of Nevada, nearly 1 in 4 families reported being uncertain about the ability to meet their basic needs, in particular housing. And beyond that, in that same survey, 26% of Nevada families reported feelings of hopelessness and despair. All of these households that were surveyed were households with children. I think it's also important to note, as a part of this discussion, that the impact of these issues not only are widespread, but disproportionate. And so there are segments of our community that are experiencing this despair and homelessness at rates even greater than the national average, and even greater than some of the households or counterparts in our community. I also want to note that as a part of this discussion, while we had been on a trajectory to see progress for children and families, that is shifting. So to highlight ways in which it is shifting, here is just one survey where during the first period that these families were surveyed, those reporting concerns about being able to make their basic needs or expenses were nearly 50%. And in the last quarter of last year, it had dropped to 38%. I should note for you that during that same period, those families were likely benefiting from the extended child tax credit, where they were receiving an additional benefit based on a number of children that they had that allowed them to meet their basic needs because they were receiving that additional supplement. Unfortunately, we know that that supplement has ended. So while we had gotten to a place where we had shifted from nearly 50% of all children and families being concerned about meeting those basic needs to getting to over a third, still over a third, it is likely much worse because some of the supports that we were leveraging federally to pull folks out of poverty are now exacerbated because that assistance has sunsetted. I also want to note, as a part of that discussion about can we make progress, can we do something that would impact this issue in ways that improve things for children, I want to say that there's the possibility, if we looked at our previous data book for the period prior to the pandemic and early pandemic, we had made some progress. You'll note that as it relates to children in households where they have high housing cost burden, and high housing cost burden is defined as households paying more than 30% of their income toward housing. Then in the case of Nevada, it was 47%, nearly half. As we went into the pandemic, it was a third. You can note that even recent reports happening this week suggest to us that this has significantly shifted for our families, including noting things like, for example, this past May, we saw our highest inflation rate since 1981, and in Southern Nevada alone, a 26% increase in housing costs for children and families here in this community. I also want to note, as I talk about some of these key stats from some of these publications, that as we think about where we are with our progress in the case of our children's economic well-being, which includes a component on housing defined as paying 30% or less of your income on housing. Even as we went into the pandemic, we were at a D in that area for our children and families. I think I will also note as a part of this discussion just a few things that I think are important. Median home price up by 26.7% since March of last year. That's over a quarter increase at a time when the wages are not growing at that pace. Typical rental rate, $1,805. The amount needed to be able to afford a two-bedroom rental in our community, $45,000 just to afford a two-bedroom. And the Brookings Institute issued a report just this week that indicated of the 10 most common jobs in our economy, in the case of Southern Nevada, 7 out of 10 wouldn't afford someone a studio apartment, and 6 out of 10 in Reno would not afford someone a studio apartment in this community. As we talk about how can we fast track eviction, I hope that we would consider the ways in which we are impacting children and families in our community. Another similar report noted that 33% of middle income families cannot afford housing in our community. And 93% of low-income families are cost burdened as well. This is troubling. So when you ask us, what do we know about the state of housing and its impact on children, we would say to you that it's dire. And so that in a context where it's dire, to look for ways to expedite folks into homelessness is challenging. I now want to note that we do have the potential to move the needle there, and to turn it over to my colleague at Schoolhouse Connections, who's going to just reinforce what she said about whether or not there is a place for families. Because oftentimes in this discussion, it's like, well, they'll go somewhere or someone will help them. The research and findings suggest that that's not a case, that this pushing into homelessness doesn't result in some other safety net catching families. Aaron?
Thank you. Just to underscore this point and hope that it's driven home for you, homelessness is more than a housing problem. It has a negative impact on child development, and families experiencing homelessness face multiple barriers to accessing early childhood programs that can in turn provide comprehensive support, not just to the child, but to the whole family. The next two slides, you'll see some more studies that show the impact of eviction on child development, particularly how it causes trauma for young children. So first, on the next slide, you'll see that evictions can cause irreparable damage to children. And just a summary of the impacts there: cognitive, mental, and physical health challenges, poor academic performance, which really gets at the point that this is more than a housing problem. This has multiple generational impact and can impact children and their families throughout the course of their educational career, and it impacts their livelihood then. And then the next slide, just to be brief here and to really drive the point home, from the Health Affairs Policy Brief in 2021, they noted considerable studies linking eviction to negative birth outcomes, increased child hospitalization, and increased rates of food insecurity among young children. And I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Tyler Garner.
I'm sorry, Dr. Tyler, for the record, I just want to note two additional considerations as we look at these slides. While I recognize the economic impact of this issue, I also want to highlight the inherent latent effects of this practice and the implications for some of our systems. So when you see something like impacting cognitive, mental, and physical health, I hope you hear impacting our health system, impacting our mental health system, and driving or increasing costs. When you hear something like physical assault or accidental injury, hear public safety. And so as we think about the cost-benefit analysis of these short-term strategies or approaches, I hope we're accounting for the costs on the back end. You see poor academic performance there. Hear education system. Someone needs to address the learning gaps or lags that naturally result from the process. Also here, as you think about this, that it happens as early as preschool. So before we're ever even talking about third grade reading levels and the connection between that and incarceration, we're at a place where our children are distracted and disconnected because we aren't thinking through it comprehensively or as an ecosystem where each of these things are interdependent. I would say to you also, as a part of the next slide, that if you believe that there are certain children that are too young or that it's too early for them to really know what's going on, that this finding suggests that the impact of this issue begins in the womb with poor maternal health and healthcare costs that to date are untold for us because we are not connecting the dots as it relates to these practices and their impact on systems and communities. And so as you consider the possibilities, hear it from a couple of places. As I think about this practice, what is the ability to create savings? Because I'm looking at prevention and some other interventions that take into consideration the long-term effects of these decisions. And so I'm going to turn it over now to our School Readiness Policy Director, who wants to emphasize some more of those educational considerations for us.
Pardon me. Before you begin, I just want us to be cognizant of the time. There's another meeting right behind us, and we want to leave a little time for public comment. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, committee, for your patience and diligence. Annette Dawson-Owens, for the record here, grateful to serve as the School Readiness Policy Director for the Children's Advocacy Alliance. Grateful for some of those data points that our intern Rebecca Espinoza also shared to talk about how 1 in 4 families is struggling to keep up on their rent. And 93% of extremely low income families are cost burdened in Nevada. So as we look around, this is very real and right next to us. In Reno, 48.9% of shared income is needed for home ownership. In Nevada, for the 2018-19 school year, 1 in 13 children birth to 6 were experiencing homelessness. 44% of young women age 18 to 25 and 18% of young men 18 to 25 were homeless expectant parents in the U.S. Children experiencing homelessness are generally not served well in general and educationally. In Nevada, 91% of children under age 6 experiencing homelessness were not served in early education. Only 9 were served. Access to early interventions, early learning experiences are crucial for setting up a child for success. We know that the single best predictor of a student's success is their kindergarten readiness. Thank you. Pre-pandemic, nationally, students experiencing homelessness graduated at a rate of 67.8%, compared to 80% of economically disadvantaged and 85.5% of all high school students. These rates are expected to be much lower post-pandemic as a result of such disruptions. Homeless children commonly experience delays in language literacy and social emotional development. Homeless children begin Head Start behind their low-income peers in these developmental skills. 20 months after staying in an emergency shelter, children scored worse in pre-reading skills and had higher behavior problems and early developmental delays. Homelessness in early childhood is correlated with poor classroom engagement and social skills in early elementary. Students experiencing homelessness are more likely to experience child welfare involvement and early school failure. As was mentioned before, homelessness is often hidden. Once evicted, most families with young children who become homeless are often shut out of other services and systems, becoming hidden. More than 80% stay with other people temporarily or in motels, putting them at risk and not eligible or prioritized for housing and homeless assistance. We must bring a humane course of action to this situation. An individual recently testified at a committee meeting that they were taking a student home that was very angry and had been kicked out of school after school, transferred to a final school. When she took the individual home, she found that they were living in a small apartment with 7 to 9 other individuals, and that the single mother at the time was having to choose between paying her rent, keeping the utilities on, or providing food. No wonder the student was angry. Basic needs were not being met: food, shelter, clothing, emotional needs. There's a humane way to go about making sure our most vulnerable children and populations are not further harmed. We heard from a number of individuals today at the beginning of our meeting who were college students, seniors, individuals with health issues, those who had experienced homelessness, and concerns were expressed for those with intellectual disabilities, as well as children and families in general across the spectrum. I myself am a renter with 2 teens who are dependent on living in their home and having access to their CCSD schools. My landlord could apparently evict us with no cause and 7 days' notice. They could have raised our rent beyond my financial capability. Luckily, they did not, but I know what that was like to experience that and worry about that. We must go forward with better processes and in more humane ways, post-pandemic especially. Again, 1 in 5 are struggling to keep up with their rent. Look about the room. It is concerning. The worry is about stable housing, and there is much struggle. I will now turn the presentation over to my esteemed colleague, Deshaun Jackson.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Deshaun Jackson, and I have the privilege of serving as the Safety and Welfare Policy Director. Eviction is an issue that affects everyone, including homeless and struggling youth, our foster youth, and so many more. It's an issue that, as mentioned before, not only affects a young person's basic needs, but their physiological and self-fulfillment needs. Everything from housing and food to safety and belonging. It's an epidemic that has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and the continuous inflation costs of basic living. Many youth transitioning from foster care and or without a parental or adult figure face homelessness, financial insecurities, and inadequate access to mental health services. If nothing is done and the evictions continue, there will be dire consequences for many of Nevada's foster youth and youth without a parental or adult figure. In a recent survey done by the John Burton Advocates for Youth found that over 1 in 5, or more than 22% of youth reported experiencing an episode of homelessness since the start of the pandemic. I'm not sure if many of you have ever faced eviction, but it's a scary and traumatic event in the lives and in the eyes of young people. You have no idea where you're going to stay. You're bouncing from one place to another, unstable, without any form of security. You see the pain, anguish, and uncertainty in the eyes of your parents trying to do the best that they can do. I was that child so many times over and over again, and this was before the pandemic. As someone who's experienced Nevada's foster care system and have siblings who have each faced their own challenges and battles within the foster care system and homelessness, I understand the important need to be proactive in the response against evictions and the impact that it will have on the lives of many of Nevada's children and families. In a survey conducted by Think of Us, Foster Youth Success Alliance, their field centers for children policy practices, and research and foster advocates, Minnesota bar similar trends to nearly 50% of foster youth respondents reported housing instability and homelessness. More than 73.8% reported high financial insecurities, with top needs being housing, bills, education, and care related to the needs and food. I have the pleasure of leading Nevada's Youth Advisory Board, Nevada Life, Leaders in Future Excellence, as well as Clark County's Foster and Adopted Youth Together. These two boards come together to meet to discuss all issues regarding child welfare. These are a group of extraordinary young people that are still in care that have decided that they want to make an impact in the system. These youth and these groups have voiced concerns regarding housing, among other challenges. Miriam Wright Edelman, founder and president emerita of the Children's Defense Fund, said, "Homeless shelters, child hunger, and child suffering has become normalized in the richest nation on earth. It's time to reset our moral compass and redefine how we measure success." Thank you.
I took Tiffany Tyler Garner for the record, and now on the mic. Conclude with this. There are approaches, and it's important to note that as some national thought partners considered what we might do to stabilize families, a number of those approaches have been underway during this pandemic period, but some have sunsetted. And so I highlight this slide to note things like we've seen recent investments in affordable housing. Yes, we have expanded legal services to some capacity. Yes, we've strengthened the child tax credit and at one point had lifted nearly 40% of children living in poverty out of poverty, but that is sunsetted. We have the opportunity to think about how we support youth transitioning from our foster care system. As a matter of fact, at the end of September, the additional supplement of $200 that they had been receiving will sunset if you take no action at IFC on June 21st, for those who are a member of IFC. We also have been supporting the expansion of healthcare access as we grapple with this pandemic. But we need to ask ourselves, what will be sustained? Our poverty, our challenge, our children's plight, or some real strategies that bring us to a full recovery for everyone as a part of this process? You have some resources at your fingertips. So there have been recent investments in programs like the home visiting program here in Nevada, as well as the community health workers, where there's an opportunity to actually have professionals go into homes and help families navigate the challenges that they're facing before they find themselves on a short track to homelessness or eviction. Please invest in those programs. That's part of the work that can be done tangibly right now. We also ask you to consider how we're going about some of the things that we've recently supported. So there's been a lot of discussion about equity in schools and specifically leveraging opera funding to ensure equity. As we do that, we can ask ourselves, and what does that mean for the children that we know will be experiencing homelessness if they're fast-tracked into it? We also ask you to consider the ways in which we might prioritize housing for children with families, because we know that the impact is not only an immediate impact for those families, but a direct impact to our future, because that's who will lead, run, support, and drive our, hopefully, country while I'm in retirement someday, and you too. And we also ask you to consider how we might leverage the investments that have happened during ARPA to include a real plan for our community as a whole in the future. And so how do we begin making sure that it wasn't just a one-time shot at change, that sunsetted when it sunsetted? Thank you for your time today, and thank you for considering this other aspect of this issue. We are really appreciative of this holistic evaluation of the issue.
Thank you, Dr. Tyler. Thank you, Ms. Dawson, Mr. Jackson, and Ms. Patterson. This is such an emotional issue, and it is critical that we discuss it at length in our community in depth, in a holistic manner. And I'm glad that you all were able to bring us another perspective on what are the effects of summary eviction in our community. We only have about 17 minutes left. We've got to get a few questions in. Any questions from the dais here in Southern Nevada? I don't see any. Are there any questions from Assemblyman O'Neill in Northern Nevada?
No, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to ask you all to, you're excused, but I want to tell you thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming today. You always bring the goods, Dr. Tyler, and I'm very grateful. Thank you so much to you all. At this time, I'm going to turn this hearing back over to our esteemed chair, and thank you so much for the opportunity to lead this discussion.
Thank you so much. Lest any of you think we've suddenly been possessed and don't have questions, the committee has actually just agreed with me to ask those offline since we are running up into the time barrier. So you can expect some phone calls, emails, or people approaching you as you walk out of the room. But I know how important it is to our adoring fans to make public comment. So I wanted to make sure that we had sufficient time for public comment today. I see people who I think have been waiting. I don't, maybe they're not making public comment, but I know people have been here all day. So without further ado, I am going to open up the floor for public comment in Las Vegas. Anybody wishing to give public comment will have 3 minutes to opine. And I see someone coming up to the table already. Go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, committee members. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Quentin Savoy. That's Quentin. Last name S like Sam, A like Apple, V like Victor, WOIR, and I'm a member of the Nevada Housing Justice Alliance. We're the tenants' rights organization, coalition, not organization, maybe one day, that ran Assembly Bill 161 last legislative session with an aim towards banning summary eviction. I really appreciate the robust conversation, the work of this committee by agreeing to have this conversation. We know that summary eviction disproportionately impacts the communities that our coalition is working in, marginalized communities, Black women, Black families, and so on. I won't regurgitate a lot of what I heard. I listened to the last committee hearing and I was really heartened by the comments from the Apartment and Realty Association. I agree that the summary eviction process is hard to navigate, the forms are confusing, but we cannot let education solve for, it cannot be the solution for failed policy or an outdated process. This is a unique process to Nevada, and I didn't hear anyone mention that today. We've had tons of research conducted, and from what we have gathered as a coalition, we've not been able to find anywhere else in the country that does this process this way. Nevada is the only state in the U.S. with a summary eviction system in which the burden of initiating eviction court proceedings fall on the tenant, not the landlord. It's wholly unique from others by not requiring a summons, complaint, lawsuit, or hearing to evict a person from the property. Now, while education might help mitigate that, folks should be guaranteed to get their day in court. We're the only place that does this, and you don't see widespread public education campaigns in other major cities where this is not happening because they have to go through a formal process. I really appreciated all the conversation from the Apartment Association and the Realty Group to try to figure out some level of compromise, but I feel like we are going to be beyond the point of compromise because of how bad this problem has got. Let's please keep in mind that this policy shows up differently than how it looks when it's in a BDR or when it's in NRS. Families are sleeping in their cars. And the Assemblywoman said earlier, Summers Armstrong, that we can't adequately talk about this issue without talking about the rising rents. And all I can sit here and think about are the folks that work for Ms. Vasquez at the Apartment Association that are leasing agents. They probably can't afford what it would cost to get an apartment or pay the rent in this climate. So having rising rent and a summary eviction process has us careening towards a housing crisis that we can't have. I'm heartened as well that we did not have a massive tsunami of evictions, but that's not to say that we are immune from it. So thank you for this work. I continue to look forward to working with you all. I'm definitely going to be talking to my community members and with our coalition. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great day.
All right, if there's anybody else in Las Vegas wishing to give public comment, now is your chance. Not seeing anybody else, we'll move up to Carson City for people in person to give public comment.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Christine Saunders, and I'm the Policy Director with the Progressive Leadership Alliance in Nevada and a member of the Nevada Housing Justice Alliance. Our coalition formed after the 2019 session to bring tenant voices directly to the legislature and speak on exorbitant rent increases, the harmful effects of summary evictions, and the lack of tenant protections available in the state. This morning, we heard from some of those tenants, families, seniors, college students, all whose lives were disrupted in ways that could have been prevented if we had taken action last legislative session. We know that our communities cannot thrive when our neighbors are constantly at risk of unfair displacement. Housing stability is the foundation for safety and security, children's educational success, positive health outcomes, economic opportunity, and equitable, vibrant communities. Evictions and economic displacement impact us all by putting more economic burden on our communities through increased demands on social services, shelters, and hospitals by families who become homeless and other costs associated with the disruption caused by housing instability. By contrast, stable homes promote educational opportunity for children and economic opportunities for families, allowing Nevadans to save for a house, pursue new employment options, and open new businesses. The stories you heard this morning were only a tiny fraction of Nevadans who are struggling. We cannot let these issues continue any further. We must put an end to summary evictions, a process unique to Nevada. We must increase tenant protections and ensure affordable housing without absurd rent increases. You have the opportunity to do those things with the BDRs before you, and the community is expecting action this legislative session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lilith Barron, Lilithbaran. For the record, I'm a policy associate with the ACLU of Nevada and also a member of the Nevada Housing Justice Alliance. Today we heard from seniors, students, parents, farmers, and even a city council member about the harms summary evictions are causing Nevadans statewide, one who was even evicted while in the hospital. We didn't have to hear those stories today. In 2021, the legislature had the opportunity to end summary evictions, and we are seeing the devastating consequences of not doing so. The people getting evicted are often those on fixed income, compromised health, and have no other options but to live unsheltered due to the plethora of other problematic practices that we are seeing from landlords, such as extreme price gouging, excessive application fees, harvesting of application fees, and source of income discrimination. These challenges are often traumatic and can be deadly. We need to keep people in their homes now more than ever because we do not have the infrastructure to help them otherwise. It is wonderful to hear that there are some more responsible property owners. However, that is not what we are seeing in the north or in the south by large. Right now in Reno, we are the second highest rising rent in the country, where you have to make over $37,000 a year to afford a studio apartment. I'd also like to add that I often work among the unsheltered community, and while many are employed, none are landlords. I also would be remiss if I did not address a conversation that took place in another presentation from law enforcement. I would like to briefly comment on the conversation and remind everyone that since its inception, policing has functioned as a racist institution to patrol and monitor enslaved Black people. Much of this legacy can still be seen in the way our communities are stripped of resources and over-policed and over-surveilled. In addition to the overwhelming data that shows Black people are profiled, prosecuted, and killed at a disproportionately higher rate than their white counterparts, in Nevada, Black people are 1.8 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people, and that is a fact. How can we, in the wake of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jorge Gomez, Ayanna Stanley Jones, and so many others, still be sitting here debating whether or not race has anything to do with the types of interactions our communities have with the police? It is irresponsible to continue this debate once the numbers have shown you beyond the shadow of a doubt that racism is alive and well in policing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Scheibel and committee members. My name is Nick Shepak. I am the State Deputy Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. I'm going to take us back for a moment to the first presentation from the Director of Post, Director Sherlock. He mentioned a fear with AB 116 traffic tickets and his funding. And it was put on the record by the Vice Chair, but I think it bears repeating. All evidence shows that civil traffic tickets do not decrease the amount of revenue. The vast majority of states, all but 12 at this point, have this system. When Carson City stopped issuing warrants, they saw an increase in revenue generation. But I think where the real issue is with post and revenue is the fact that we have a system in Nevada to where multiple government agencies are dependent on crime to fund their budgets. If we create safer streets, if cars become more autonomous, semi-autonomous, if traffic tickets decrease because we increase safety in our cities, all of a sudden, our post loses funding. The administrative office of the courts loses funding. We need to look at these funding structures. When we rely on fees on crime to fund necessary functions like post, we are making a mistake. So we do agree there. We want to thank the Department of Public Safety for all their hard work. That presentation was concerning in some areas and very hopeful in others. We believe that this committee and all the help you have offered is going to get them the information they need to make that deadline. The Fines and Fees Justice Center wants to offer its assistance in any way it possibly can. We know this issue. We have draft language that we believe can go on these civil citations that will be understandable to anyone who gets them. We're happy to share that with anyone who's interested. And lastly, they talked about having two different tickets, one for civil, one for criminal. We believe that is absolutely necessary. If you have information for both civil and criminal offenses on the same ticket, you will confuse both criminal defendants and civil defendants. And having those two different tickets is going to be key because we do not want to have mass confusion from our defendants. And it really is something that if they're looking into, they should consider strongly. We want to thank you so much. It was a long day. You are always great for having us. And Assemblyman O'Neill, I hope you get that home-cooked meal.
Tanya Brown. Okay, hi. Tanya Brown, Advocates for the Inmates and the Innocent. Chair Scheibel, we would like to thank you for your comment you made earlier this morning regarding implicit bias. We truly appreciate that. And we'd like to thank all the presenters here today and ditto the comments that have been made by previous individuals. As for the issue of the renters. Now, we need to find some kind of solution to this existing problem. I think maybe we might start looking at the renewing of the renters' leases and putting a 1% to 4% cap on landlords for approximately 5 years. That would keep the renters, the landlord from raising the rent so high. Is it possible to pass a law that will allow the state to house, to first option, the state to have the first option in 10 to 20% of foreclosures dealing with banks and county and back property taxes. I know that the state will work with people for first-time home buyers. In fact, a former home that I had 25 years ago, it was recently purchased about less than 2 years ago from a first-time home buyer. The state helped in that, and she paid $42,000 for this home. Why couldn't we apply something like that and allow the state to buy back and have the first option before it goes to a public auction? I think we could save quite a bit of money. I'll make it really brief. I will submit the section of Section 8, housing, for your review as well. I think that's very informative to how applicants are put on a list based on income to receive housing voucher, and I'll let others speak. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Kristen Lewis. Last name is spelled L-U-I-S. I am a Justice of the Peace here in Carson City, Nevada. And I came to speak not on the matters that you consider today, but AB 424 that was passed in the last legislative session. And I want to address this legislative matter for a few particular reasons. My concern is this passed during COVID. There wasn't significant opportunity for public comment, and certainly not having people present. There was some telephone comment. But some of the things that were not considered, and I've provided some materials that we feel are important and relevant for your consideration, maybe in this next legislative session, and that includes Marcy's Law, which was passed and became effective November 27th, 2018, which gave victims of crime the right to be heard, to be notified of any court proceedings coming up, and to have reasonable notice. And under paragraph 6 of Marcy's Law, it indicates that the legislature shall by law provide any other means necessary or useful to secure to victims of crime the benefit of the rights set forth in this section. I would submit to you that having a hearing within 48 hours of a defendant's arrest with regard to detention does not provide reasonable opportunity to notify a victim that they might be present or be able to hear what happens at that 48-hour hearing. And I indicate that because in these types of situations, similar to the housing discussion you just had, when there's volatile relationships and somebody gets arrested for a domestic battery, it's hard to know where that victim's going to go. In order to reach that victim and let them know that they have this right and that there's going to be a hearing and to provide them that access, can't always be facilitated within 48 hours, especially when you're dealing with weekends and holidays. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. Additionally, I think that when this law was passed, it really didn't look into some of the other things that were put in place. One thing by the Supreme Court was 80 KT 539, which was an order adopting the statewide use of the Nevada pretrial risk assessment tool that was developed by Judge Hardesty in combination with a panel of people which included judges from rural jurisdictions as well as non-rural jurisdictions and other people involved. The goal in that matter was to come up with a tool that is based upon a nationwide tool. It's a nationwide tool that's based on evidentiary-based practices. And the goal was to guarantee what we've always looked at is that the person is not a risk to not appear and not a risk to the community if they're released. And so that pretrial risk assessment tool, which analyzes a number of factors, none of which focus solely on an individual's ability to pay, but whether or not they're homeless, whether or not their criminal history shows that they might be a risk to the community, things of that nature. It provides fairness and consistency in the determination. That was ordered to be implemented statewide in all of the counties, whether you're talking about rural jurisdictions or urban population, it didn't matter. That was required to be implemented.
And that brings you to 3 minutes, so I'm going to need you to wrap up.
Okay, I'll wrap up quickly. Also, the Valdez-Jimenez case, which requires a state to consider least restrictive means and non-bail for defendants who are in custody. What my point is that with these 48-hour hearings, we're duplicating the process of addressing a person's custodial status. And when we do that, prior to having a 72-hour hearing where a complaint would be filed by the DA's office, we would appoint an attorney to represent somebody, we're not really changing anything. Based upon our pretrial risk assessment tool, we're already reviewing a person's custodial status within 24 hours of their arrest. We're doing that by way of reviewing a probable cause report.
And that is your 3 minutes and a little bit more. So thank you for your comments, and we'll move on to the next public commenter.
Hi, Max Cortez, Court Administrator for Carson City Justice Court. I wasn't planning to speak today, but I didn't realize that you had some testimony today from about AB 116. I wanted just to clarify that Carson City did stop issuing warrants. I believe that was in 2018. And the judges agreed to do that, and we did see a increase in collection, but that was because the court allowed payments to be made on cases where there was no longer a warrant. Prior to that change, we would not allow payments to be made. The person had to pay the warrant in full. So once we changed that and no longer issued warrants, the payments did go up because the persons were now allowed to make payments. So they didn't have to come up with $300. They could start making $50 payments because a lot of people didn't have the means to pay for the entire warrant and the fee. So I just wanted to clarify that. I know that was represented time and time again at the legislature. We did try to clarify that. It was very difficult with not being able to be here in person. In any event, I wanted to clarify that for the record so that all of the members know that the warrants, yes, we did stop, we did see an increase, but that was because people could then make payments where before they would have to pay the entire warrant fee and the citation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if there's anybody else in Carson City to give public comment. It looks like there's not. All right, so I think we do have a few more people on the phone. I know we are past our 3 p.m. mark, but I also know what it is like to wait on the phone to give public comment, and I would never cut those people off on purpose. So we will go to the phone lines for public comment. Please, BPS.
Thank you. If you wish to give public comment at this time, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue.
Anne Marie Grant for the record, sister of Thomas Purdy, murdered by Reno Police and Washoe County Sheriff's Office during a mental health crisis. In reality, law enforcement have no duty to protect anyone ever. C. Warren v. District of Columbia. Besides, when they're actually in their care and custody, as was my brother, he was no threat, hogtied for 40 minutes. Yet even while hogtied and pleading for medical attention, one deputy told Thomas, "You're making me nervous wiggling around." This was in the Sally Port as my brother was hogtied, begging for his life with 4 other officers around. Yet that officer was being made nervous by that, i.e. wiggling around, i.e. struggling to breathe. Just because the method of deadly force wasn't a gun with my brother, his murder deserved a review by the district attorney. However, District Attorney Chris Hicks never did that for my brother or the 2 other men asphyxiated at Washoe County Jail within 1 year, Nico Smith and Justin Thompson. I guess Nevada needs a law making a review mandatory if someone dies in the custody of a jail there. If counties don't have medical staff, they need to get rid of their restraint chair if they can't protect the arrestee, and the law mandated it, so they need to just totally put that chair out in the dumpster. Nick Sarah died in a restraint chair, even with medical staff. Once in a chair, they're no threat to anybody and should be evaluated. Excuses regarding that are disheartening, especially when you've had a loved one asphyxiated to death by law enforcement. It was blatantly obvious my brother was mentally ill and in a crisis and never assaulted or threatened anybody. Instead of calling an ambulance, Reno PD arrested him for trespassing at the Peppermill Casino where he was a guest. Thank you, Senator Harris, for speaking truth. Implicit bias exists even if some committee members don't get it. Thank you, Chair Scheibel, for explaining that. I wonder if any of law enforcement is willing to talk about if they've ever seen a bad cop, because the MO of law enforcement in Nevada is to pretend it doesn't happen here. When Nevada has many George Floyds of their own, Jacob Blair, Jonathan Wayne, Ronald Wayne Bunch, Micah Abbey, Thomas Purdy, my brother, Nico Smith, Justin Thompson, Christopher Cowan, Con, the list actually goes on and on. Law enforcement supported bills in 2021 because they knew that it would not cause them to have to make any meaningful action, and opposed stronger bills until they were watered down. No impact. I'm curious how the opposition presented at the 21 legislative session against the bills. My brother was a 38-year-old male with mental illness, and he was asphyxiated, hog-tied, well, calling out to officers, saying, yes, sir, and ma'am. So it did happen in your state, and it's on video. You can all Google that. Thank you for all the committee members' hard work. I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody, and thank you. Greetings. My name is Therese Melcourt. I'm a resident of Henderson, Nevada. I'm an advocate with Faith in Action here in Nevada in mass liberation. I'm going to be speaking on the tenant and landlord eviction. I'm currently facing eviction for the second time due to my landlord saying that because I have 3 small children, that other kids in my neighborhood come and play in his yard. This is impacting me because I didn't have a plan B. This is our home. We only have been here for 1 year, and it's impacted my life with staying focused at work and just trying to focus on a daily life. Because this is all I worry about, I'm scared that we are going to be homeless due to having low credit score and my background. I also feel very hurt because of the reason we have to leave our unit. I have no control over other people's children, and I can only do and tell my children how to behave and where to be and not to be. I feel belittled. I feel that my say-so is just being dismissed and not even heard. 1 second. It's not even been heard. It's just been dismissed. And I also reached out to legal aid, and I was told that there was nothing that I could do. He recently put me on a month-to-month lease, so she was telling me that there was nothing that I could do if he was to say that I had to leave within the 30 days. And if he wanted to say that he wanted his unit back, that I would have to go and that he will win. I didn't or couldn't stand a chance. I don't understand why I'm not being heard. I do not need another eviction on my name. I'm already being denied from my 3-year-old eviction. It's hard to sleep when your 30 days are counting down. I don't know where else to go for help. I reach out to so many resources and programs, but I haven't had no luck. I would like for something to change. I would like to be able to fight this. Eviction process needs to be attended first because it impacts not only just me as an individual, but our community as well. I know that I'm not the only person that's facing this unnecessary eviction, and I'm not only that, but it's just really hurting me, and I'm not happy, and I just want to be happy and in a home with my 3 small children. So I would like to thank you for your time, for hearing me out, and that's all I have to say. Thank you, guys.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sean Beth, and I work as a cook on the Las Vegas Strip, and I've been a culinary union member for about 10 years. In September of 2020, I was evicted from a place that's owned by Westland Real Estate, and they served a 5-day notice for a summary eviction. When I got that eviction notice on my door, I felt terrified. It was during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so while I was working, there was a lot of uncertainty from the closures, and there was no hope of a vaccine at that time. I worked with some lawyers to file a motion to stay and a motion to set aside. Both were denied by David Brown, who's the hearing master, about 2 to 3 days after I filed them. I felt like he didn't even look at my motions and just rubber stamped the eviction. I was evicted in September of 2020. when there was an eviction moratorium. When I got the 24-hour notice from the constable, I moved as much of my stuff as I could into my car, started living in hotels, and then I contacted Attorney General Aaron Ford's office to help, and they did. About a week after I was evicted, I got a call and an email from the landlord, again, Westland Real Estate, and they said they confirmed with their corporate office that a mistake was made in evicting me. They said I could move back into the same unit and that I could pick up the keys since they had changed the locks. No apology or anything, but I'm really thankful that I did have the help from AG Ford's office. It really helped me during difficult times. This was the first time I was ever evicted, so I felt intimidated going through the process. I didn't know where I was going to go or what I was going to do with all my stuff. I was scared of becoming homeless or having to live in my car. I'm diabetic, so I was especially worried about how I was going to be able to store my insulin. Remember, in September, there was no vaccine access yet, so it was pretty stressful all around. Going through the summary eviction process myself, it felt like there was no compassion at all. I felt like landlords have the upper hand and they just do it. And if they just want you out, they do it. And I'm sharing my story to encourage the Nevada Legislature to end summary eviction. Thank you.
Chair, your line is open and working. However, there are no additional callers at this time.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our staff for all of your help. That concludes our meeting for today. We have one more meeting with presentations and discussions in July. Then we will have our work session in August. I look forward to seeing many of you there. And now this meeting is adjourned.